The alien jungle stretched endlessly beneath a dense canopy of violet foliage, each leaf gleaming faintly in the thick, humid air. Strange sounds echoed through the wilderness, predatory shrieks and the unsettling buzz of unseen insects. The Federation soldiers stood in a loose formation, their shimmering exosuits gleaming under fragmented shafts of light. These were the finest warriors from across the galaxy, each one bred for war and enhanced with cybernetic implants. They surveyed the jungle with a mixture of disdain and boredom. Standing at the edge of the clearing, Captain Vrex of the Andorran Guard sneered as he watched the human contingent disembark from their primitive dropship. The Earth delegation, a ragtag mix of scientists and engineers in dull gray uniforms, looked painfully out of place. Their clunky equipment contrasted sharply with the sleek and adaptive gear carried by the Federation troops. "They sent this?" Vrex scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "A handful of fleshy primitives with outdated tools. I knew Earth was desperate to join the Federation, but this is pathetic." Laughter rippled through the ranks of the Galactic soldiers. They were beings of superior design, capable of surviving in hostile environments without the need for cumbersome survival packs or archaic firearms. To them, the humans were little more than an inconvenience, a diplomatic gesture rather than a meaningful contribution. The Earth delegation, however, remained unfazed by the ridicule. At their center was Dr. Elena Park, a brilliant xenobotanist with a fierce determination etched into her features. She ignored the jeers as she directed her team to set up their initial base of operations. Beside her, a man stood quietly, his sharp eyes scanning the jungle with an unsettling calm. He was taller than most of the scientists, his muscular build concealed beneath a simple tactical uniform. There were no visible ranks or medals on his chest, but there was an unmistakable air of authority about him. His name was Commander Ryan Hayes, a Navy SEAL with more jungle operations under his belt than most soldiers had missions. The Federation soldiers hardly noticed him. Why would they? To them, he was just another primitive human, unremarkable, forgettable. That was fine by Hayes. He had long learned the value of being underestimated. As the humans began unpacking their gear, Captain Vrex approached Dr. Park, his expression a mask of condescension. "Tell me, Doctor," he said, his voice oily with mock politeness. "What exactly do you plan to accomplish here? Identify flowers? Perhaps collect soil samples?" Dr. Park straightened, her eyes narrowing. "We're here to contribute to the mission, Captain. Same as you." Vrex laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Contribute? The Federation has conquered worlds far more dangerous than this overgrown weed patch. What could you possibly offer that our technology hasn't already mastered?" Before Park could respond, Hayes stepped forward, his voice low and measured. "Maybe you should let us do our job before making assumptions." The laughter died abruptly. Vrex's gaze shifted to Hayes, his amusement replaced by a flicker of irritation. "And who are you supposed to be?" "Commander Ryan Hayes," he said simply. "Earth Navy." Vrex sneered. "A soldier? From Earth?" He leaned closer, his voice dripping with derision. "Do you even know how to survive out here, Commander? This isn't some quaint little war zone on your backwater planet." Hayes met his gaze without flinching. "We'll see." The tension between the two men was palpable, but Dr. Park stepped between them, her voice firm. "We're wasting time. Let's focus on the mission." Reluctantly, Vrex backed off, though the smug grin never left his face. "Good luck, Commander," he said mockingly. "Try not to get yourself killed." Hayes didn't respond. He had nothing to prove to Vrex, or anyone else for that matter. His job was simple: ensure the survival of his team and complete the mission. The jungle, however, had other plans. As the humans and Federation soldiers moved deeper into the wilderness, the air grew thicker, heavier. The sounds of alien creatures became more oppressive, each rustle of leaves hinting at unseen dangers. Federation scanners buzzed and flickered, struggling to maintain a coherent readout of the environment. Hayes noticed it immediately: the subtle changes in the terrain. the strange patterns in the vegetation. This wasn't just a jungle. It was a living, breathing battlefield. And they were intruders. He glanced at the Federation soldiers, who trudged forward with overconfidence, their attention fixed on malfunctioning devices. They relied too heavily on their tech, blind to the warning signs that screamed danger to a seasoned operative like Hayes. "Stay close," he murmured to Dr. Park and her team. "Watch your footing." She gave him a curious look but nodded. "What do you see?" "Patterns," Hayes said quietly. "The jungle's shifting. We're being funneled." Park's eyes widened, but before she could respond, a sharp metallic shriek tore through the air. Federation soldiers scrambled as their communication systems crackled with interference. Panic rippled through the ranks as something massive moved just beyond the tree line, its presence more felt than seen. Captain Vrex barked orders, his voice rising above the chaos. "Defensive positions! Engage target!" The Galactic soldiers raised, their weapons, firing bursts of plasma into the shadows. Hayes didn't move. His instincts told him this was just the beginning. He tightened his grip on his rifle, eyes scanning the dense foliage. The jungle had a way of testing everyone who entered it. And Hayes knew he was about to be tested once again. The jungle was no longer just a hostile landscape. It had become a predator. The thick canopy darkened the world beneath it, filtering what little sunlight managed to breach the atmosphere. Leaves shimmered with an oily sheen, shifting subtly as though breathing in rhythm with the alien wilderness. The Federation soldiers, confident just hours ago, were now visibly tense, their ranks fraying under the weight of unseen threats. Ryan Hayes moved silently at the edge of the group, senses sharpened by years of experience in unforgiving environments. His boots barely disturbed the ground as he advanced, eyes flicking across every vine, every twitch of foliage. The jungle was speaking, though its language was one only a soldier like Hayes could understand. A rustling sound swept through the trees, like a predator circling unseen prey. The Galactic soldiers froze, their gleaming exosuits humming faintly as they switched to defensive protocols. Plasma rifles were raised, but there was an edge of uncertainty to their movements. Their high-tech scanners flickered uselessly, unable to cut through the electromagnetic interference saturating the area. Captain Vrex growled in frustration, slamming a gauntleted fist against his malfunctioning visor. "Damn jungle's messing with our systems," he snarled. "This is ridiculous. We're blind out here." Dr. Elena Park, crouched beside Hayes, whispered urgently. "What's going on? What do you think it is?" Hayes's voice was low, steady. "Something's hunting us. Multiple somethings, probably." Vrex overheard and scoffed. "Paranoid nonsense. This is just a dense forest, nothing more. We fought worse." Before Hayes could respond, a sudden burst of movement erupted from the underbrush. A creature unlike anything the humans had ever seen launched itself into the clearing. A nightmare of serrated limbs and translucent skin that shimmered like liquid glass. Its eyes, black voids devoid of mercy, locked onto the closest soldier. The Galactic forces opened fire in a panicked volley. Blazing arcs of plasma seared through the air, scorching trees and foliage, but barely grazing the creature as it moved. With unnatural speed, it struck a soldier square in the chest, sending the armored warrior flying backward into a tangle of razor-sharp vines. "Fall back!" Vrex roared, his earlier arrogance dissolving into fear. The order was chaos incarnate. Soldiers stumbled over each other, retreating in disarray as more creatures emerged from the shadows. Their forms blurred against the dense foliage, their movements fluid and unpredictable. Plasma fire crackled, wildly, illuminating the nightmare unfolding around them. Hayes didn't waste time yelling orders. He grabbed Dr. Park by the arm and pulled her toward a narrow ridge on higher ground. "Move now!" he commanded, his voice cutting through the cacophony. Park's team followed, wide-eyed and breathless as they scrambled after Hayes. He led them with practiced efficiency, every step calculated to avoid triggering traps hidden beneath the jungle floor. The Federation soldiers, less disciplined and increasingly desperate, continued their futile attempts to hold the line. They're just making it worse. Park gasped, her voice tight with fear. They don't know how to fight without tech. Hayes said grimly. And this place knows it. Reaching the ridge, Hayes dropped to one knee, scanning the scene below. The creatures moved like shadows, their forms barely distinguishable from the shifting vegetation. The galactic soldiers were being torn apart, their advanced armor offering little protection against the relentless onslaught. Vrex, his pride shattered, stumbled into view, firing wildly as he retreated. One of the creatures lunged at him, its serrated limbs poised to strike. Without hesitation, Hayes raised his rifle, sighted the target, and fired a single precise shot. The creature crumpled mid-leap, its body dissolving into a pool of iridescent liquid. Vrex, panting and shaken, stared up at Hayes in disbelief. How? Controlled fire, Hayes said flatly. Not panic. The captain's face twisted with a mixture of gratitude and resentment, but he said nothing as Hayes motioned for him to climb the ridge. The remaining galactic soldiers, seeing their leader retreat, finally broke ranks and followed. They reached the ridge battered and bloodied, their arrogance stripped away by the brutal reality of the jungle. We can't fight these things head-on, Park said urgently. Not like this. Hayes nodded. We don't need to. We just need to outthink them. He scanned the terrain below, mapping potential routes and choke points. The creatures were fast and lethal, but they had a pattern, a rhythm to their attacks that betrayed an underlying strategy. Hayes could see it, clear as day. Vrex, he said, his tone commanding. We're going to lead them into a bottleneck. Tight space, limited angles. You and your men hold the line while we set traps. Vrex bristled but nodded reluctantly. Fine. What do you need? Discipline, Hayes said sharply. No panic, no wasted shots. Follow my lead, or we're all dead. The captain's jaw clenched, but he gave a curt nod. Hayes turned to Park. You and your team stay behind me. Keep your heads down and do exactly what I say. Park's eyes met his, steady despite the fear flickering behind them. We trust you. He offered a brief nod, then shifted his focus back to the battlefield. The creatures were regrouping, their movements more cautious now. They had learned to respect the humans' firepower, but that respect wouldn't last long. Here they come, Hayes said quietly, his grip tightening on his rifle. The jungle was still alive with menace, but Hayes had faced worse. And if the galactic soldiers wanted to survive, they would have to do what they had mocked the humans for doing all along. Adapt. The air was thick with tension, the jungle eerily silent after the last assault. Smoke drifted in lazy tendrils from scorched foliage, the acrid scent mingling with the metallic tang of blood. The surviving Federation soldiers stood in a loose, disoriented cluster on the ridge, their polished exosuits scratched and dented, a grim testament to the brutal engagement. Fear lingered in their eyes, fear tempered now by something new. Respect. Ryan Hayes knelt beside a fallen tree, examining the terrain below. His sharp gaze tracked every movement in the undergrowth, every subtle shift in the jungle's restless rhythm. Beside him, Dr. Elena Park wiped sweat from her brow, exhaustion etched into her face, but determination unyielding. We're not out of this yet, Hayes said quietly, breaking the uneasy stillness. They're regrouping, waiting for us to screw up. Captain Vrex, his once gleaming armor streaked with dirt and ichor, stepped forward, scowling. They just keep coming, he growled. How do we kill something that doesn't seem to care about dying? You stop fighting like a machine, Hayes said without looking at him. You start fighting smart. Vrex bristled, his pride still raw from the earlier humiliation. We're not primitive savages. We don't rely on instinct like your kind. Hayes finally turned to face him, eyes cold and unyielding. And that's why your soldiers are dead. The words hung in the air like a blade poised to strike. For a moment, it seemed Vrex might snap, but then he exhaled sharply, the fight draining from his posture. Fine, he muttered. What's your plan? Hayes pointed to a narrow gorge choked with tangled roots and thick underbrush. We lead them there. It's tight enough to force them into a funnel, limit their movement. We'll set traps along the perimeter and use controlled fire to pick them off. Vrex frowned. You really think that'll work? It will if you follow orders, Hayes said bluntly. No panicking, no wasting shots. We do this right, and we survive. Dr. Park stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension. We'll help with the traps. My team can rig proximity charges using the equipment we brought. Hayes nodded approvingly. Good. Keep it simple but effective. We don't have time for anything fancy. The soldiers moved quickly, galvanized by purpose. Park's team worked alongside the Federation troops, their previous divisions forgotten in the face of survival. Under Hayes's direction, they reinforced natural choke points, laying down crude but deadly traps. Spike pits camouflaged with leaves, tripwires linked to explosive charges scavenged from damaged equipment. Despite their earlier mockery, the Galactic soldiers followed Hayes's instructions without question now. Vrex himself took up a position near the front. His plasma rifle held steady. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by a grim determination. Hayes surveyed their defenses one last time, checking every angle and line of sight. Satisfied, he turned to the group. They're coming, he said simply. As if summoned by his words, the jungle exploded with movement. Shadows rippled through the foliage, a wave of predatory shapes surging toward the gorge. The creatures moved with terrifying speed, their translucent forms shimmering in and out of visibility. Hold your fire, Hayes ordered, his voice calm but commanding. The soldiers tensed, fingers hovering over triggers as the first wave of creatures closed the distance. Hayes waited, every nerve on edge, timing the moment with precision honed by years of combat. Now! A coordinated volley of plasma fire erupted, lighting up the gorge in blinding bursts. Creatures screeched as they were torn apart mid-leap, their bodies disintegrating into pools of iridescent fluid. Others triggered the traps, impaled on spikes or shredded by explosive charges. But still, they came. Hayes moved with lethal efficiency, his rifle bucking against his shoulder as he fired precise, measured shots. Vrex fought beside him, his earlier recklessness replaced by cold focus. The Galactic captain no longer wasted ammunition on wild bursts, but instead mirrored Hayes's methodical approach. Dr. Park and her team huddled near the rear, monitoring the traps and resetting charges as needed. Park's hands shook, but she forced herself to stay calm, knowing the mission hinged on their resilience. The battle raged on, each second stretching into an eternity. The creatures, relentless and adaptive, began to find gaps in the defenses. One lunged at a soldier near the perimeter, its serrated limbs gleaming. Hayes was there in an instant, slamming the butt of his rifle into the creature's head before finishing it with a point-blank shot. "We need to push them back," Vrex shouted, over the chaos. Hayes shook his head. "We hold the line. They'll break before we do." And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the assault faltered. The creatures hesitated, their movements no longer fluid and coordinated. They circled warily at the edge of the gorge, their numbers thinned and their aggression tempered by caution. Hayes lowered his rifle slightly, breathing hard but steady. "They're learning," he said grimly. "They know this isn't worth the cost anymore." Vrex stared at the retreating creatures, disbelief mingling with awe. "We did it," he said quietly. "For now," Hayes replied. "But they'll be back." The soldiers stood in stunned silence, the realization of their survival sinking in. Park let out a shaky breath, her expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "You were right," she said to Hayes. "They had to learn to adapt." Hayes nodded, but said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on the jungle, where the shadows lingered like a promise. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. The aftermath was eerily quiet, the jungle settling into a deceptive stillness as though the chaos of battle had been a distant nightmare. Wisps of smoke drifted from smoldering patches of foliage, and the metallic scent of scorched earth clung to the air. The bodies of the fallen creatures had dissolved into faint iridescent pools, leaving no trace of their once lethal forms. Ryan Hayes stood at the edge of the ridge, his rifle slung across his back. His sharp eyes scanned the tangled landscape for any lingering threats, but none emerged. The jungle, it seemed, had retreated along with its feral inhabitants. Behind him, the surviving Federation soldiers moved with weary purpose, tending to the wounded and reinforcing the perimeter. Their arrogance had been burned away by the brutal lessons of combat, replaced by a hard-earned respect for both their enemies and their unlikely human ally. Captain Vrex approached, his armor dented and smeared with grime, but his posture steady. The sneer that had once twisted his features was gone, replaced by a grim acknowledgement of Hayes' leadership. "You were right," Vrex admitted grudgingly. "We fought like fools. If it weren't for you, we'd all be dead." Hayes met his gaze, without gloating. "You adapted when it counted. That's what kept you alive." Vrex nodded, a flicker of newfound humility in his expression. "I won't forget it." Nearby, Dr. Elena Park was crouched with her team, examining what little remained of the alien creatures. Her hands moved with practiced precision despite the exhaustion evident in her posture. The jungle had thrown everything it had at them, and yet here she was, still standing, still fighting for knowledge. "We need samples," she said, her voice steady despite the strain. "What's left of their biological matter could be invaluable." One of her team members frowned. "It's already breaking down. We won't have much time." Hayes approached, his presence commanding even in the aftermath of battle. "Make it fast," he advised. "We've bought some time, but we're not out of danger yet." Park looked up, her expression both weary and grateful. "Thanks to you, we have time at all." He shrugged lightly. "Just doing my job." She stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "You did more than that, Hayes. You saved lives and proved something." "Proved what?" "That Earth belongs here," she said firmly. "In the Federation. Maybe they laughed at us before, but after this, they'll think twice." Hayes' mouth quirked into a faint smile. "Good." As Park's team worked swiftly to secure the samples, Hayes took a moment to survey the survivors. The Federation soldiers, once dismissive and condescending, now moved with a disciplined efficiency born of hard-won respect. They listened to his commands without hesitation, their pride tempered by the brutal reality of what they had endured together. Vrex joined him again, his voice quieter now. "We underestimated you humans," he admitted. "Thought you were weak, primitive. Turns out you're just different." "Different doesn't mean weak," Hayes said evenly. "Sometimes it just means you see the world another way." Vrex inclined his aunt's head. "I'll remember that." The jungle remained ominously quiet, but Hayes knew better than to trust its silence. This place was alive, always watching, always waiting. They had won a battle, but survival here was a constant fight. Still, there was a strange sense of peace in the aftermath. A fragile moment of victory carved from chaos. The Federation soldiers had learned humility. The human delegation had proven their worth. And Hayes had reminded everyone, including himself, what it meant to lead. As the horizon began to darken with the approach of night, Park stood beside Hayes, her gaze thoughtful. "What now?" she asked. "We reinforce our position, gather what we came for, and get out alive," Hayes said matter-of-factly. She smiled faintly. "Always the pragmatist." He gave a small shrug. "Pragmatism keeps people alive." Silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable but reflective. They had survived the impossible together. And those scars, both visible and unseen, would linger. So would the lessons learned. "You think the Federation will change their opinion of Earth after this?" Park asked quietly. "They'd be idiots not to," Hayes replied. "But it doesn't really matter, does it? We don't need their approval. We just need to keep doing what we do best." "And what's that?" Hayes' expression hardened. Surviving, the jungle stirred faintly in the distance, a whisper of its enduring presence. But for now, it seemed content to let them be. Victory, though fleeting, was theirs to claim. And as Hayes stood there, rifle slung across his back, and the weight of hard-earned respect settling over the weary survivors, one thing was certain. The Galactic soldiers would never laugh at Earth's scouts again.